uncertainties about the impacts of mining, about the levels of pollution, and this engages in technical and scientific debates that have been going on for a long time. So in this context, we frame our research in this context of power, how power operates, knowledge, and knowledge co-production. There's already been talks about this morning with Marta on power. We argue that power is obviously not static, it's circulated. And we argue that these power relations, especially in these conflicts, can be reverted with local and scientific knowledge combined in a co-production framework. So we've seen this already in other experiences, even this morning, in popular epidemiology, AIDS or medical activism, citizen science. So in environmental conflicts, we argue that different kinds of knowledges are valued and are strategic and can be blended to produce counter-hegemonic knowledge. So this is out of my research in my PhD. I explore this process it's another type of knowledge co-production called what I term activism mobilizing science. I examine how lay citizens, communities, local groups engage with professional scientists in order to generate alternative knowledge to channel dominant discourses and engage in practical activism. These local groups gained legitimacy through this process. They knew that something was wrong. They knew that there was an impact there, but they weren't able to prove it. So by engaging with scientists, they were able to prove they gained the legitimacy, and through this process, they gained also visibility. In a way, they became empowered by this. But then after, together with Mariana, we examined this process, but through the perspective of two key technical experts that collaborated with these communities in environmental justice conflicts. And we examine in detail, and that's what we're going to show you, how this process of co-production happens. So one of these key technical experts is Bruno Chareyron. He's a nuclear engineer, director of CURAT. CURAT is a nuclear watchdog organization. It's an independent organization paid by contributors, mostly in France. And they have this independent radiological laboratory, which I would say is one of the best ones in the world in terms of independence, for its independence. And they do radiological studies in uranium mines and nuclear power plants. They're obviously very active in France, but recently they've gone to different other countries, and they've been to Fukushima after the Fukushima disaster. And the relationship I explored the most, the activism mobilizing science relationship I explored the most, was in Niger and Namibia, and I will focus on that in the next slides. The other,
I don't know. Just for the recording, okay. Yes. So the second technical expert that we analyze is Robert Moran. I don't know if you know him. He sadly passed away a year and a half ago. And he actually is like an expert hydrogeologist that works as a consultant basically for communities. And he has been in many places in Latin America in the world consulting communities that needing an expert opinion on environmental impact assessment, also for courts, also for training for sampling, training for analyzing, community training for sampling and analysis of water quality, and also for different droughts. Communities brought him to work with him and to assess with him impacts of mining, future potential impacts or actually ongoing conflict impacts, of a mine. I knew Moran in 2003 when I was an activist in a conflict in the south of Argentina, and he was a consultant from that community. And so I know him from that particular experience, and Marta knows Bruno from this other experience. We also had in-depth interviews with these two experts, going through their lives and their work with communities and understanding how they work with the communities and what was the impact of their work in different cases. So these are the two persons and processes that we analyzed. So what, So as Marta was saying, knowledge co-production. We know this is something everybody knows, but what we analyzed and what we found is that there's actually not only knowledge co-production, but in the process of knowledge co-production, there's different types of co-productions that entail different types of knowledge and different types of actors. And we highlight these 3 key stages in the co-production processes where this technical consultant or technical expert enter into play. Knowledge co-production, the co-production of the interpretation of data, and the co-production of strategies. And this entails, as I said, different types of knowledge and different types of actors. So knowledge co-production is maybe the mostly known by everybody. And Marta has a beautiful example from the case she worked with Bruno in Africa, so I would let her.
Yeah, so we argue that so you need the technical knowledge and the local knowledge, and this co-produces new knowledge. And the case the Bruno explained, because I wasn't in Niger with him, this local organization called Angiriman, with the head, and the head of this organization, Al-Mustafa Lathen, it's in the context of this uranium mine, Bayereba, that's been there for more than 30 years. And so they knew they were impacted. These are workers of the mine, so they knew they were impacted. They just didn't know how or why. They didn't even know what radioactivity was. So they contacted Bruno. They asked him to come. Bruno came in 2003 to Niger, and they were they were walking. You can already imagine they were walking to the town, and they were next to the market, and Al-Mustafa Lathen said, well, this is scrap metal that comes from the mine and is being sold to the people, and people use this scrap metal to build their own houses. And Bruno said, scrap metal from the mine? So let's try, and so with the Giga counter, they measure it, and in fact, this scrap metal was heavily, heavily polluted with radioactivity. And so this became one of the key issues that they argued of the impacts that the mine, as a key example of the impacts the mine had in the surrounding communities. So here, obviously, you can see that you need the technical knowledge of Bruno, no? The expertise, the measurement techniques that then, by the way, Al-Mustafa Lathen learned, and he has his own Giga counter. But you also obviously need all the knowledge about the local geography, what to look at, come to this river, look at all the social knowledge of the health impacts too. And this gave Al-Mustafa Lathen, obviously, a legitimacy, a self-assurance, a visibility that now he's used to, empower him and empower other people in the community. He has meetings with local leaders, with women groups, and this is obviously empower the whole community to have more knowledge about what radioactivity is, and they can ask for demands of the mining company to, if there's to have more protection for the workers. If there is a vehicle accident which involves radioactivity, they're more quickly addressed because they can denounce it. So this is obviously empower them at the local level.
So knowledge co-production, this is a known step. And the second one, which is key, and I think is one of the main things we want to stress in the presentation or the research, is the relevance of co-production of interpretation. Because usually, in many cases, many scientists or many consultants, if you want, generate certain data that can or not be co-produced, but then it stands without any further analysis or discussion with the community to understand which are the implications of those results. So in this second stage, which is co-production of the interpretation, there is this process where the technical experts know which are the uncertainties, which are the key results of the analysis. Because when you get a result, for instance, in water sampling, you have all these different measurings. So what to focus on? Is it a certain metal? Is it salinity? So there is this expertise on what to focus and what are the implications of these results. And from the community or the local point of view, there's all this knowledge on which are the key elements in the public debate, which are the key elements that are being discussed, which are the key elements that a certain company or the government are focusing on or denying, how uncertainty is played out as being or not being there. Yes, an example. So an example of Moran. Okay, let's give an example about Robert Moran. Robert Moran went to Esquel, where there was a large-scale gold mine, which I don't know if you know, it's open pit. It means like blowing a hole in the mountain to process the rock and taking and taking away the metals. And in that mountain, there was the secondary source of water of this town, of Esquel. And this is a dry area. And the communities were really concerned about water, but also about cyanide, because cyanide is used in the mining process. And they also were concerned because they saw like strange colors in some streams in the mountain where there was actually some exploration going on, some drilling. And so they took Moran there to walk around the mountain, to see the streams, to see the rocks. And what they find out together is that there was evidence of a certain structure of the mountain. That means that there was some evidence that internally the mountain could be really broken, like with many, I cannot come with a specific word in English, but this would mean that if there would be some pollution leakages or some cyanide leakages or a bad or many, some leakages that would go through the water, it would be really difficult to control that. And there was not information on the geological structure of the mountain. This was actually one of the key arguments that then led to have a political support, to have a referendum, to local referendum, and also to have local actors to oppose the mine. So this was a strategic argument that led to the success of the local movement claim that there was many uncertainties and risks regarding the mine. Yeah, you can give it.
Another, coming from Bruno and his work in Namibia, they took several examples around this Rosing mine, also uranium mine, and what we mean by Bruno being key in the interpretation is that I guess you have, when you go there, you take many samples, upstream, downstream, you take samples around the mine, and then you have to decide which of these samples is key. Because, of so many samples, the community doesn't really know what to do with that. Berchen didn't, the head of EarthLife Namibia didn't know what to do with that. So Bruno said, okay, let's look at this together. So they found that it was key, the example of the sample downstream of the mine that showed there was higher contamination because of the river, the river flowing next to the mine. So there was higher contamination downstream from the mine. And they also found it was crucial the fact that they found waste rock outside in the parking of the mine, meaning that they use waste rock, which is radioactive, to build installations within the mine and outside the mine. So between Bruno and Berchen, they decided these were the two key issues that they will bring to the public. No? So there's an interpretation of that data. I mean, you can also have an expert coming at this stage. You can have an expert, a colleague of ours not long ago said that she had been asked to interpret some data, some water data, because this community had come with all these water, these water measurements, and didn't know. They needed help to interpret that data.
Just to point that we are not saying that Bruno and Bob Moran had, in every case, these three types of co-production, but we found these three in different cases, just to say this, depending on each case. And the last one, which I think is interesting, is a co-production of strategies. And this has to do with all the non-technical knowledge and expertise that these persons, external participants in the process have. The networks they know, they've been in many places, so they know many actors, they know many strategies that work or didn't work in other places. They know campaigns, they can connect all these local actors. And this is different type of knowledge these persons have, and that also enter into play when they exchange or they collaborate and they work with local communities. Local communities know what's a key political stake, what's been discussed. Is it water? Is it access to land? Is it and Bruno and Moran and many other external participants know, okay, in other places, this has been the technical argument that has helped, or this is the key element that could help. So there's this, and we want to stress that in other time we presented this, some people said, okay, but you're highlighting here all this technical guy knowledge. And no, we want to stress that actually local knowledge is absolutely key in these processes. It's not like only this external person bringing all this, but it's the co-production, real co-production, and the knowledge local people have. an example, well, yes.
Sorry. And so one of the examples that we found in Bruno, you remember the case of Niger and Al-Mustafa Al-Athen, when they came up with all these results that didn't, well, when they came up with these results, they, and they said, well, what do we do with all this? Al-Mustafa Al said, well, I know what I have to do in Niger. I know what I have. He had a whole strategy plan of how to influence things in Niger. And Bruno helped him in France. He said, okay, I can help you build a pressure on a river so that it has better practice. And Bruno had Al-Mustafa Al has come several times to France, has done several tours. He won the Free Nuclear Award last year, and then he's been touring with he came to the mine, the new mine, uranium mine they want to open here in El Retortillo in Spain. So here Bruno is also getting kind of a visibility thanks to the 2 minutes. Thanks to the contacts of Bruno. So I think that this, but you can see how Bruno brings the strategy, for example, in France, and Al-Mustafa is more in Niger. But you can see how this Bruno can also help in this stage, in the stage of strategies.
So just some conclusions. So we want to stress how this process brings legitimacy and visibility to the actors that then become part of an extended peer community process when they were not before in many cases. But we also stress this thing that we think it's underexplored, which is the relevance of this co-production of the interpretation to have a better strategic use of this co-produced or not knowledge that enters into play in the conflicts. We also want to stress that these processes are really they really make the difference when they are controlled by local groups. When the local groups are the one engaging with these technical experts, bringing them locally, guiding the process, this is when it makes a difference in the conflict they are part of. And we want to conclude with this idea that this co-production process entails a politicization of knowledge. And by this they politicize the why, who, how, and for what knowledge is produced, interpreted, and mobilized. And this, we want to stress this also, this politicization of knowledge process. And that's it. We want to thank you. And just to say that we are now discussing a lot how to expand this discussion from this kind of consultant to other roles, like academic or scientist. So we are really interested in knowing your views from that. Thank you.
So when you talk about climate change, usually you start by things that were related strongly to surface temperatures. So these are all observations here. This is kind of classic pictures you'd show. The top two. The first is time series of global mean surface temperature, and for this there's a very good record of about 150 years. Arctic summer sea ice extent is the next one. That doesn't go back quite as far, maybe 50 years. Those are pretty monotonic. There's ups and downs, but by and large, they're pretty monotonic. And this is pretty much true for anything that's strongly related to temperature. You would get the same thing for sea level rise, for example. So from a scientific point of view, these have high signal to noise ratios, right? And it means you can do the classic a detection attribution paradigm. You see that something's happening, you can only explain it with anthropogenic climate change. You cannot explain it without its necessary and sufficient causation. It's also anchored in accepted theory, starting with the greenhouse effect. But the two panels on the bottom are very different. These are related to atmospheric circulation like the jet stream or monsoons. So the third one is the Southern Oscillation Index. That's part of the El Nino ENSO signal. The bottom one is all India summer monsoon rainfall. In both cases, again, we have very reliable time series over 100 years. But you see, there's no signal to noise there. They're going up and down, up and down. Maybe there's a trend, but you certainly couldn't prove it. On top of that, we have no theory for any of those changes. There is no theory of how Southern Oscillation or El Nino might change, and there's no theory for how the all India summer monsoon rainfall are. There might be 10 theories, but that means there isn't any one theory. So we don't have the clear observational record, and we don't have theory. On top of that, the climate models don't agree. The climate models all warm if you add greenhouse gases. It's just not physically possible to do anything else. Sea level always rises and so on. But when you look at things to do with atmospheric circulation, this is an example of the circulation over the Atlantic European sector in Europe. These are 4 different climate models. It's just the wind in the lower troposphere, so about 3 kilometers above the surface. It's a pretty good indicator of weather conditions. The contours are the climatology, or the average state of the model, and the colors are the changes. And then where there's a stippling is where the models, there's a statistical confidence that this is what the model is really showing as a response to climate change, because these are ensembles of runs from the same model. And you see that in some cases it's red, that means that the wind will increase, the westerly wind. In some cases it's blue, means it'll decrease. And you see that different models, they all have a signal, but it's in different signs in different places. So this is very different from what we see with, say, temperature or sea level, which is monotonic. And there's a lot of work that would show that these kind of variations would have a lot of direct impact for droughts and heat waves. So pretty much anything in Europe connected with weather is related to the wind, or especially in the winter, is related to the jet stream. So, of course, if you take an average of this, which is the usual thing, you take a consensus of the models, but because the sign is positive in some places, negative in others, the multi-model mean isn't actually a physically plausible outcome, because the multi-model mean will be something very boring. This is, by the way, a prediction for the end of the century. And that's circulation, but it really matters. You may not worry about winds in the lower troposphere, but you do worry about rainfall. And so these are classic plots from IPCC that shows the predicted change on the left and surface temperature on the right in the precipitation. And the stippling here is when most of the models agree on the sign of the change. And you see that for surface temperature, it's a pretty straightforward statement. It'll warm everywhere. But for precipitation, it's much more complex, because precipitation is predicted to go up in some areas and down in other areas. If you look where the stippling is now, it's actually pretty restricted, and it's stippled at the higher latitudes. In Norway, it's going to get wetter, for example. But in the tropics, it's mainly over the ocean. There's a few exceptions. Mediterranean is the really big exception here, which is predicted to have more drying. But by and large, there's not a stippling where most people live. So, so if we worry about actually things that matter to people, we aren't able to say much with any confidence. Either the models actually give different answers, or there's just a lot of variability, which means that we don't have the signal to noise. So when you look at how information is constructed, and this is where the ethics comes in, I think. So this is the IPCC, and the Working Group 1 is, which is my kind of area. The summary for policymakers has a number of high-level statements, and the one about the water cycle is here. It says changes in the water cycle will not be uniform. It says the contrast in precipitation between wet and dry regions and between wet and dry seasons will increase. What that means, if we just go back to this plot here on the right, you see that if I told you what the mean climate, the Mediterranean is already a dry area, and so on. Northern Europe's already a wet area, so it's what's called the wet get wetter, dry get drier. But if you look at in the tropics, the robustness is coming from the oceans, and people don't live in the ocean. So this statement is reliable. It's a scientifically defensible statement, but in the tropics, it's only reliable by including the oceans. But we don't care about really precipitation over the oceans. We care about precipitation over land. And then there's a caveat, although there may be regional exceptions. So that, of course, increases reliability. But together, this statement is completely uninformative for any particular region over land. Because what if you're in one of those regional exceptions? And actually, the wet get wetter, dry get drier paradigm is known to be wrong over land. There's a lot of literature. So this is misleading even, actually, you could say, but it's certainly uninformative. And of course, in any context, there's always a trade-off between reliability, or you could say accuracy, and informativeness. So this came up, this idea about sloppy science. Well, you got to be a little bit careful for example, if I give a weather forecast for tomorrow, which is a probabilistic forecast, and it's basically just the climatology of Barcelona, that'll be very accurate in a probabilistic sense, but it doesn't have any information. So it's, of course, the tighter you make your PDFs, the more informative they are, but the less reliable. So if you look at things like the storm tracks, which I was talking about is really important for weather, actually there's not a single statement on circulation changes or anything related to circulation changes in the whole summary for policymakers, which is amazing. That's because the summary for policymakers has to go through line-by-line approval by all the governments. And the scientists know that they couldn't get anything through there. It's hard enough to get obvious statements through with people arguing over every comma and everything. So anything that was at all complex, they just don't bother putting in. But you can dig down to something like the technical summary, which does not go through that line-by-line approval, and just says this. For example, substantial uncertainty, low confidence remains in projecting changes in Northern Hemisphere storm tracks, especially for the North Atlantic bases. That's not much information. So I guess I came at this as a person who works on circulation, saying, can we do better? Are there better ways to present what information is there? Another factor, this is something about, in some sense, well, the quality control, so that's a loaded term. So the IPCC has been working, there's been, of course, tensions between Working Group 1, which is the climate science part, and the Working Group 2, which is the impacts and adaptation, and some tensions about what is sloppy science or not, and what is valid evidence. So they tried to produce a good practice guidance paper, and they say that we should avoid selection bias, which of course is a classic statistical concern, that we don't look at the data based on the observed responses. So we're not allowed to look at what's happened. We have to motivate our questions from the scientific theories. Well, that's a pretty bizarre statement when you think about it. And also, we must try to really deal with any confounding factors. Of course, local environments are, it's a selection bias, because I live here, I'm interested in this area, and confounding factors, we're full of confounding factors, because wherever people live, there's things in the environment. So if we're interested in local aspects, that could be local in space or local in time as well, this basically says that we have to avoid that. So in a way, what it is it's representing a form of epistemic and specifically hermeneutical injustice. So I've been struggling about trying to find ways to go from the global statements to more local statements without being sloppy. Of course, we know that the most severe climate impacts are generally exacerbated by the human-modified environment. This is the urban heat wave effect. This is just nighttime, summertime temperatures from a couple of nights of data over southern Holland. You can see Rotterdam at the bottom and the Hague in the upper left. And it's no surprise why the certain areas of the city get hotter. This is temperature, it's a temperature contrast than the others. And in fact, in the Hague, there was a study showing that it coincides with the poorer neighborhoods, which is, again, no surprise. So to a climate scientist, these are confounding factors, but of course, they're the things that really matter. So climate science emphasizes, I think, the avoidance of type 1 errors. Type 1 being a false positive or a false discovery, it would be sometimes called, or a false alarm. But Lisa Lloyd and Naomi Oreskes have recently published a paper questioning this thing about why is it rigorous to be a conservative. So there's this idea that if you talk about type 2 errors as a climate scientist, people accuse you of being alarmist, and there's a pretty strong group that is, they're more rigorous. But why is it rigorous to emphasize type 1? I think you could argue it's appropriate for statements like climate change is unequivocal. That's a very strong statement. You want to be able to make that without any qualification. But when you're talking about regional impacts, like anything related to risk, I think it's not the right approach. And in drug testing, when you first test to see that the drug works, so then you guard against type 1 error, but then you test to see that the drug doesn't have any harmful side effects, and then you guard against type 2 error. So Lloyd and Oreskes make the point that there's nothing scientific about type 1 or type 2. That's all based on your values, of course. So what this means, of course, is there's no such thing as value-free climate science. No, some people said that P&S cannot be value-free. I don't think anybody would be surprised at that statement. But if I tell IPCC that climate science is not value-free, that is radical, I think. They just will not, don't accept that. So I actually, Lisa Lloyd who I've been talking with a bit, I think she was feeling that maybe post-normal science was a bit unfair to Kuhn. And I hadn't actually read Kuhn, so I went and read Kuhn's book this summer. It's a wonderful book. And I think actually Kuhn is pretty radical, I'd say. Kuhn doesn't say that there's truth. Definitely not. Anyway, Kuhn has a statement in there: a paradigm can insulate the scientific community from those socially important problems that cannot be stated in terms of the conceptual and instrumental tools the paradigm supplies. So I think this is what we've got. This type 1 concern and the confidence straitjacket, as I've called it, is a paradigm that is insulating the climate science community from socially important problems. And a quote from Schellenhuber, who founded the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Studies, says the IPCC is stricken with a probability obsession. I guess we've heard about the numbers thing here. Rather, we should identify possibilities. Of course, from an uncertainty point of view, there's epistemic uncertainties, which are due to a lack of knowledge, but they're different from the aleatoric uncertainties, which are just due to chance. So from a climate point of view, you'd say that the natural variability of the climate system is aleatoric. That's a property of the real world. But the epistemic uncertainty is how will climate change affect circulation, let's say. That's not the same thing, because that's a systematic uncertainty. There's only one truth in a way, and we don't know what it is. So yet IPCC treats them the same way. It puts everything in the same bin, and that just seems crazy, because as soon as you recognize this, epistemic uncertainties are not part of the real world. They're inherently subjective. So we can't be objective about those things. So I've been trying to develop a concept I'm calling storylines, and actually I think it's the same as your scenarios, absolutely. I think maybe it's just a bit more radical in the physical science world, because we think we know the laws of physics, so we don't need all this stuff. Whereas, of course, once you go step outside of physics, it's more natural. So just published a paper in Climatic Change, where we just define it as physically based unfoldings of past climate or weather events. So it could be the past, or it could be plausible future events, or some pathway. And the key thing is I've taken a lot of heat over this from my colleagues, but it's not a prediction. So you don't have to assess the probability or anything. You're just saying it's a plausible outcome, and then you place your emphasis on the causal factors involved. And for climate change, plausible changes in those factors are actually for impacts. So for me, it's providing a scientific language for expressing the uncertainties in climate change without losing sight of the robust aspects. So I guess a way of avoiding being sloppy. I think, but also it turns out it wasn't my motivation, but it's very clear that it corresponds to how people perceive and respond to risk. There's a lot of psychological literature on this, by relating their experience or to imagined experience. And there's a lot of work now on imagined futures. And from a resilience point of view, you can work backward from the particular vulnerability or a decision point. And it's a very effective way to, for example, think about compound risks, which are very hard to do in a probabilistic way. And I think also importantly, it allows consideration of these non-climate anthropogenic factors, which absolutely get into the post-normal science world. And I think that can be empowering, because as we've just heard actually in the last talk, that knowledge is what you need to talk about vulnerability. You can't do it without it. So just to give an example of, actually I got the term from a Swiss meteorologist. So there was, in the Swiss Alps, there was a rain on snow event a few years ago, which basically wiped out a village in a valley. And so the setting was that it was in the fall, a cold front had come through, it had dumped 1 meter of snow, then a warm front came through, and there was what's called an atmospheric river tucked in behind it, which is just a flow of moisture. And the warm front melted the snow, and it rained, so they got a huge amount of rain. And then it caused mudslides and so on. So the top left is one use of a storyline. It's kind of a partitioning of the different causal factors. So in this case, it was a sequence of events, and then you could look at how climate change might affect those different events or whatever. It wasn't forecasted by the weather forecasts, and actually they have very good measurements. So those are actually rainfall measurements, in the Swiss in that valley. And it was not a surprise. It's a well-known meteorological circulation, a mountain circulation, but it's just outside of what the weather models can produce. It was a salient event because of the mudslides and everything, and then, of course, there were adaptation measures to try to deal with the future. So just to summarize, I think the way the climate information is constructed and presented by climate scientists puts a premium on avoiding type 1 errors, and I would defend that absolutely for the global statements, but at the regional scale, I think what it winds up doing is achieving reliability at the price of informativeness. So storyline approaches, I think, provide language for talking about these uncertainties, but without losing sight of the robust aspects, not just putting huge error bars and everything, and addressing avoidance of type 2 errors and also the non-climate factors. And I think it relates to people's local concerns, and I guess someone else had talked about this. This was to do about the non-reproducibility issue. There's, of course, a generic tension in many fields between case studies and statistical analyses that pool data. When you pool data, if it's not homogeneous, then you're blurring things and you're losing information. So I think it's a special case of that. And there's a lot of talk in climate services of authoritative information, but I think I'm starting to cringe when I hear that term, because it seems like a gatekeeper role. And I think what's more important is being trustworthy. And Honora O'Neill, a philosopher in Britain, has talked about this in terms of needing intelligibility and accessibility, that the user has to be able to assess the value of it in their own terms. Thanks very much.
Thank you. So as we just said, I'm a PhD student from the Center for Wissenschaft's Theory in Bergen. This is one of the chapters of my thesis, Epistemological Complexity in Forest Carbon Conflicts in Kigoma, Tanzania. I'll explain these terms as I go through. This subtitle, A Step in the Wrong Direction, indicates the overall argument of my analysis. There may have been normative shifts, and not only normative shifts, I'm also saying that forest policy is going in a direction that is incorrect, and I'll explain you why. This is your first clue. Forest boundary markers gathering dust in Handeni sub-village because the project implementers did not reach a consensus with local people and communities, so they took the boundary markers down and stored them in the back of a classroom. There have been various programs for forest carbon offsetting as a compensation mechanism for climate mitigation. So we're moving away from understanding the facts surrounding climate change and towards how to address climate change and do something about it, take some action. Globally, these policies have been implemented in Asia, Latin America, Africa, the global south, through mechanisms such as the Kyoto Protocol, reducing emissions through deforestation and forest degradation, or RED plus, meaning co-benefits, and private offsetting schemes. Since the time of the Noel Kempf-Mercado Climate Action Project in lowland Bolivia, studies have shown that such mechanisms can bring adverse socio-economical consequences. However, they're politically congruent at an international level. So through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, RED has become quite huge at one time, and it's reducing in size given the findings that the carbon market did not turn out the way in which it was expected at one point. So, on the 13th of October 2014, just after my fieldwork finished, this is a letter from a lawyer stating that they will file up a case against the implementing institute of a RED pilot policy, the Jane Goodall Institute, based on the way that they are implemented eviction activities in the RED Plus pilot program. And I'm going to read to you the answer that the institution responsible gave. The institution does not see any logical reason to pay that money, because that would be the misuse of the institutional fund, which would otherwise be used to bring development of the citizens, instead of giving it to the few people without any basic reason. This is interesting that they're arguing why they shouldn't compensate the people who are paying the costs of losing their access to the forest, given that the stated attention of the policy at a different scale of analysis is to compensate people. So this is about choice of actors and who gets what. My overall research objective was to understand the socio-economic benefits and costs of the RED pilot project in Kigoma, Tanzania, or I should say RED+. And I was interested in the intersection between the actors connected to the forest and the actors connected to the project. Whereas many policy evaluations look at the objectives of the project itself, how they played out in the field, did they deliver what they said they were going to deliver, but they don't look at what is outside that sphere of influence. How has the RED+ project modified the use of and access to forests, and through which mechanisms? Who has been involved in the RED+ project and how do they gain from their involvement? Conversely, who has not been involved? And this is just intended as a brief overview of who was involved. You're not supposed to be able to read all of these figures, but there were universities and government, international NGOs, national NGOs. I was looking at an international NGO, Jane Goodall Institute, and the main donor, as indicated by the size of that arrow in comparison with the other arrows, was Norway. This stands for Ministry of Natural Resources and Tourism, and this is the state ministry who's responsible for forest policy in Tanzania, and as we can see, they were not a major channel of funding in Tanzania, whereas this is not typical of RED. RED was supposed to be implemented through the state. So my study site is here in Western Tanzania, and this is Tanzania within Africa. This is the location of the other sites, and many of these projects have had independent research by now, including findings, for instance, political ecology scholars in Oslo have found that there are gross discrepancies between the claims of policy evaluations and their independent research. Nothing sells success like success narratives. And before we go on, I'd like to just use this example of the Rufiji Delta to illustrate the concept of epistemological complexity. Bimopharis and Bassett are an example of environmental justice scholarships in the Rufiji Delta. This idealized picture of a pristine natural ecosystem, they argue, is false and damaging to local people such as the Warafuji, who also have a cultural heritage which is epistemologically annihilated by such idealized views. But of course, there can also be a stereotype, the noble savage stereotype, and what we see from observing is that there can be a mix of different peoples, new peoples migrating into the area, not only historically the people that have always been there. This is an example of what we could call neoliberal conservation, and these conservationists attacked the article of Bimopharis and Bassett quite aggressively, and this shows the plurality of perspectives present in the study area and some patterns of interaction. One of the features of neoliberalism is it can include state rollback, and we see that the state don't have a voice in this discussion, and the state were the ones blamed for carrying out evictions in this case, but we don't see what they have to say about it. Just some assumptions of forest carbon policies. They assume that changes in forest frontiers can be equated to quantifiable carbon emissions reductions. And we have to question, are these things really equivalent? A feature of such projects is they involve heavy conditionalities such as these, which we can go into further at the end if there's time. Forest carbon conflicts are defined fairly broadly. They can be material or discursive. And there's work that's been carried out on this in many parts of Africa, and indeed Latin America and Asia. But my focus in this paper is on Africa, because otherwise it would be too huge in scope. So in Tanzania, there's a well-established system for participatory forest management through these acts, the Land Act, the Village Land Act, and the Forest Act, defining various categories of land and forest reserves. And this is what land use planning looks like while it's in process. Leaders sit down and discuss where are the boundaries of the village. And interestingly, there seem to be mainly men in that photo. My methodology was semi-structured and open interviews, and also letters and records. It's a deep analysis, and if you look at the scale on this map, it's up to 20 kilometers. With my interpreters, we traveled into the forest, which is not typical of what the policy evaluation team did. They did go to the villages, but not as far and to all of the sub-villages. So I'm going to use the letter as a structure for my results, because this lawyer has summarized quite nicely. And I'll go through these points one by one. Use of force to destroy farms with long-term owners. This means burning of houses. It means beating people. It means destruction of crops. And the farmers to which this happened to have kept quite meticulous records of the damages involved. It was about 80 households in 2 areas which were geographically isolated from each other. They were not within communication with each other before the research. Lack of participatory land use planning. This is what land use planning looks like. It took place in these study villages previously to RED in 2008. It was not used in the policy design for this RED pilot project, and I can show this through my interview data. Furthermore, agro-pastoralists such as the Skooma, who are one of the largest sources of disturbance within the forest, were not considered within the policy design or how to include them in the participatory land use planning process, even though they tend to compete often for watering holes and the same resources as sedentary farmers. So there was a court case involving 9 peasants. This was dismissed because of a lack of witnesses. The forest monitors who took the peasants to court did not receive funding to go and follow up on the case, so they didn't attend. But the law here is also very uncertain, because local government does have the authority to define where is a reserve, but there are several stages in the process of gazetting a reserve in Tanzania, and during the procession through these stages, if communities contest strongly, my understanding is the final stage of actually formally gazetting the reserve isn't supposed to take place. So then, on the one hand, you can say, well, is it a reserve or isn't it a reserve? And by definition, RED is additional, so it has to be taking place in an area where there isn't already a reserve. Otherwise, it wouldn't fulfill the additionality condition. So this is inherently conflictive. Lack of recognition of village-level government decisions. So I was just talking about the district level, which is above the village level in Tanzania. But the aim of participatory forest management is that at the local level, at the village level, communities are supposed to have a say. So, from the district executive officer on the 18th of August 2011, in the middle of the project implementation phase, there was a meeting in which citizens have dismissed all the members of all the environmental committees that are enacting the issues concerning environmental conservation, including the community-based organization, the forest monitors, and environmental committee. The district executive director says this is not a thing to take lightly, but needs considerable follow-up so as we can know the problem. So they appear to be taking the matter seriously. However, in 2012, that is when we saw the largest joint patrols burning over 80 households. And finally, these farmers involved in the court case are still attempting to file up a counter case, but they can't because when they take their case to the lawyers become bureaucratic, which they have indicated means someone is bribing them not to take up the case in one particular instance, or other reasons, such as they move, but it hasn't progressed. And just briefly, the distribution of benefits to the project went into infrastructure such as schools and livelihood activities, for example, beekeeping, which was not distributed in such a way that the ones closest to the forest received those benefits. They were distributed to the ones who lived closer to the village centers. So this part of the presentation is about contextualizing my research in relation to other work that has been taking place within the exact same geographical study area where I worked. So we could say that I'm taking on the role of environmental justice scholarship, highlighting the perspectives of communities, although I also interviewed other actors and the NGO themselves and people involved in implementing the project. My results are fairly different. CIFOR and the Center for International Forestry, CIFOR's global comparative study highlights the success of the project in delivering the benefits they promised. The INDIFOR report highlights both positive and negative aspects, but it doesn't follow up on the adverse socio-economic conflicts. There's one section where they state that local people claim they have lost access to land without being compensated, but it frames it as a perception of theirs rather than an actual fact. This is to show you some of the ideologies and imagery that's used by Jane Goodall Institute, which again presents the area as pristine and unpeopled, and building on previous conservation campaigns which are fairly strong, which may have led to the criminalization of poaching and this construction of people who use the forest in a reserve as negative and deserving of punishment. And this is the scientific work, which is their focus, gene flows and genetic diversity of chimpanzees in Tanzanian habitats. So their area of interest is narrow. This brings us back to the overarching assumption of forest carbon offsetting, that monitoring, reporting, and verification is the most important priority area. In a situation where knowledge is uncertain, we need to collect more and more facts, whereas taking an alternative lens shows us that values are in dispute. And I would argue this is time to bring in reflexive engagement with science. Thank you.